and IDSA for inviting me to be here. It's a real honor to be invited to this conference and share the podium with such experienced and authoritative voices. Being the last speaker on the last panel on a day of long and productive discussions is the definition of the graveyard shift. So I'm going to, in these circumstances, do the best type of presentation, which is a short one. So I wanted to the paper that I'm presenting or that I've written tries to make the argument that basically the commentary on the India-Japan relationship is far more ambitious than the actual aims that both countries have with regard to each other. So if you look at actually even the official proclamations that are the declarations that are made by both sides, but also the voluminous commentary and op-eds and articles that are written about India and Japan, you get the sense that India and Japan are going to form a new military balance against China. They're going to usher in a new era of prosperity for Asia, that India and Japan will carry forward the march of democracy and the rule of law in the world. Right? And my contention is actually that Japan and India have a far more pragmatic and subtle understanding of each other, and their goals are more long-term and therefore will produce the kind of cooperation that is actually more enduring. And therefore to focus on the very enthusiastic commentary might lead us astray from what is actually going on at the base of India-Japan relations. So in essence, what I try to do is first start off, so my argument in a nutshell is that, that the relationship embodies an implicit bargain between India and Japan, which is that on the one hand, Japan does everything it can economically, because that is really where its comparative advantage lies, to bolster India's economic growth potential. And on the other hand, India does everything it can to lend diplomatic support to Japan's increasingly precarious position in East Asia. So this is not a military relationship. There are no real security commitments made by either side to each other. And looking forward from the Indian perspective, one can make the claim that India will continue to engage with Japan and deepen the partnership so long as the benefits of doing so outweigh the costs of antagonizing China, and so long as the US-India relationship continues to deepen in the way that it has. And the second point is really more relevant from the Japanese perspective, because the Japanese have found it easier to build partnerships with countries that are closer allies and partners of the United States, such as Korea and Australia. So in that sense, India is on solid footing so long as the India-US relationship continues to deepen. So basically, this is perhaps one of the areas where you would notice more signs of continuity than change since the recent government came into power, because the seeds were sown a long time ago at the turn of the 21st century, and we're now seeing that play out. And these are very deep understandings that both countries have of each other and plans that they have with each other that are set for the long term in a sense. So at a very high level of abstraction, if we try to understand why India is prioritizing Japan to the extent that it is, I mean, it makes sense to a certain extent, which is that, as many people have pointed out today, India is looking to diversify its strategic partnerships since the end of the Cold War. Japan, being the third largest economy with a fairly sophisticated military and no historical disputes with India, makes a fairly good partner for India. Japan itself is in a precarious position since the end of the Cold War, facing the rise of China, the increasing belligerence of North Korea, the fairly indifferent attitude of South Korea because of historical reasons with Japan, and an increasing unreliability of the US alliance. This is again a question that has come up repeatedly with regard to the new Trump presidency. What exactly is his policy going to be? He made a lot of statements about how Japan and Korea were not shouldering the right level of financial burdens in their alliances, even though Japan pays 48% of the cost of its alliance. So there are a number of explanations for why India picks Japan as a priority country in East Asia, and I argue these are insufficient for our understanding, right? So one is the look east / act east policy, right? Everyone says, okay, India's been looking east since '92 and now they're acting east, and so that's how you can explain that's why Japan is getting closer to India. But I think that doesn't really explain why Japan in particular. India has a broad-based look east and act east policy. India is engaging a lot of countries in Southeast Asia. Why does it focus so much on Japan, and not so much say on Korea, on going further south to Australia or the ASEAN countries or Singapore? And this is especially relevant when Japan chooses Japan. Another reason that people offer is that India and Japan can perhaps get together militarily to deter China, right? This is a very often balancing China argument that gets trotted out with regard to the India-Japan relationship. I would argue that the capabilities are insufficient. Even when you aggregate them in an India-Japan alliance, there's not much weight there, or not sufficient weight there, to deter China. This, Ambassador Kantha talked about earlier in the day, and I think it's very relevant. If you look at military budgets, if you look at the self-sufficiency of production in China, you look at the border infrastructure that China has built up over the last couple of decades, the nuclear balance, all these factors point to the fact that India and Japan together don't necessarily have the capabilities to take on China in a potential crisis. And this is not to say that Indian soldiers don't fight hard on the front lines. They do. But the question is, how deep is the resource base that a state has, right? And how constrained is the state in manipulating that resource base to fight a war? And how much pain can a country endure in a conflict? And on all those counts, China comes up much stronger than either India or Japan, or even together, right? Because Japan itself suffers tremendous domestic constraints on the use of force. Its defense budget has traditionally been constrained at 1% of GDP for as long as we can remember, and the Japanese GDP has not been growing as fast as the Japanese would like. We've also seen sort of tremendous societal backlash against Shinzo Abe's efforts to make Japan a more normal nation as he would like. So there are all these constraints that suggest that India and Japan don't really have the potential to militarily deter a rising China. Only a full-fledged alliance perhaps would work in this case, but even then it would be more a signal of resolve than any sort of military balance against China. Another reason that people point to is the unreliability of the US. Again, this has sort of come up in earlier conversations. What is the US's role going to be in the future in Asia? I would argue again that this is more of a concern for Japan than it is for India. Japan looks at the decreasing Pentagon budget over time. It looks at the failed rebalance to East Asia. It looks at the Obama presidency's lack of resolve with regard to Russia on files such as Syria and the Crimea, and they worry. They worry that when it comes to the Senkakus, the Americans are not going to step forward. And they're probably right. I don't think the Americans are in a position where they can step forward even if they wanted to. But on the Indian front, this is not a concern as such, because India depends far less on the US for its security in the region than Japan does. India has not been traditionally dependent. Only now is the partnership deepening. And even then, it's deepening on the understanding that India should be a net security provider in its own neighborhood. And that is a mutual understanding. So another reason that sort of people talk about is democracy, right? Okay, India and Japan are great, sort of both democracies. They believe in the rule of law and all of that. Shinzo Abe and Taro Aso have called for this arc of freedom and prosperity that spans sort of Japan, Australia, Singapore, India, and the United States as an offshore power. Abe has talked about the democratic security diamond, of which India is a critical corner, right? Again, I would say from the Indian perspective, there is only rhetorical support for these kinds of initiatives. India is not too much in favor of practically creating a concert of democracies, particularly given the Chinese reaction to such efforts, as we've seen sort of in the last 10 years. So what then, if these are not sort of the relationships or the factors that drive the India-Japan relationship, what does? So my argument is that it's a core sort of very basic bargain. For India, there are two logics, right? One is India has to build up the hard-term sort of the long-term hard power capabilities, particularly in terms of creating a foundation that can sustain higher levels of economic and military power in the future. And the second logic is that in order to credibly deter China in any future scenario, India has to invest in a minimum level of policy coordination and organizational interoperability with similarly placed countries that are suffering sort of for similar reasons. So in that sense, India's logics are fairly clear, they're fairly pragmatic, and they're not overly ambitious because they're aware of the limitations of how far cooperation can go. On Japan's side, Japan seeks a political commitment from India to use every diplomatic tool available in a future scenario where China might commit some sort of aggression against Japan. And the way Japan seeks to secure this commitment is to basically invest in creating policy interdependence with India. In the sense, Japan invests heavily in various aspects of India, particularly economic infrastructure, in the hope that in the future India and Japan will have the kind of interdependence that will allow India to bring its diplomatic weight to bear in Japan's corner in any potential scenario. So Japan has invested a lot of resources in India. So from the last 15 years, Japan is the fourth largest provider of FDI in India. That's about 7%, behind Mauritius, Singapore, and the UK. Right, and we all know that Mauritius and Singapore are more sort of financial hubs where money comes from everywhere. So as a single country that is a source of investment, Japan is actually quite highly ranked. if you account for that fact. India is also the largest ODA recipient from Japan. The shift has been remarkable in the last 10 years. It has moved into economic infrastructure far more than social sector spending. And that is again a trend you see in Japan's aid to countries who are on the sort of so-called front lines of China's rise, like Vietnam and the Philippines, where they're investing far more in strategic economic hard infrastructure. So on India's side, they're trying hard to absorb this investment. So India has, the Modi government has set up the Japan Plus cell in the Department of Industrial Promotion and Policy to provide facilitation for Japanese businesses who traditionally find it harder to work in India than their Korean counterparts for various reasons that we can get into later on. India has sort of planned industrial corridors, the government currently high-speed railways, highways and basic infrastructure, all with Japanese investment, and large amounts of it. In the area of defense cooperation in particular, you see sort of India's very pragmatic approach, which is to call for co-production and technology transfer. And this is what is currently being negotiated in the US-2 amphibious aircraft deal, and it hasn't yet, the Japanese are not yet satisfied that they want to provide that. And another pillar of this sort of pragmatic engagement is security cooperation, which basically means military exercises, dialogues, and mill-to-mill level cooperation, just to maintain, again, that minimum level of sort of policy coordination between India and Japan. So what does India do in return for Japan's considerable investment in its hard power potential long term? India offers diplomatic support. So if you see the trend, in 2000 when Prime Minister Modi visited India and had a dialogue with Prime Minister Vajpayee, Prime Minister Vajpayee said that India was primarily interested in IT and economic cooperation with Japan. Modi responded and said that actually what he wanted was a multifaceted, comprehensive partnership between India and Japan. Right? That was the starting point. You fast forward sort of 10 years from then, or about 11 years, and you see Prime Minister Singh and Noda for the first time in a statement make a reference to UNCLOS, right? The Convention on the Law of the Sea and maritime security. Now India is actually speaking the language in its public declarations that Japan wanted it to speak. India is coming on board diplomatically, in a sense. And this is also language that finds it sort of enters all sorts of declarations that the United States makes with its allies in East Asia. And of course, in 2014, Prime Minister Modi went to Japan and actually openly sort of, in a not so veiled way, made a reference to Chinese expansionism in the South and East China Seas. So you see a clear evolution of India's increasing diplomatic support for Japan's position in East Asia. So there are, I guess, a couple of limits to India's support for Japan, and I think those are limits that emerge when China essentially decides to push back, right? If China decides to essentially diplomatically or economically try to coerce India into rolling back its position, in a retaliatory sense, then India that's the limit at which India's cooperation is going to sort of end with Japan, or it's a limit for India's cooperation. So, for example, if you look at the 2007 Malabar exercise, right, where Japan, Singapore, Australia, United States, India all had an exercise in the Bay of Bengal, that elicited a strong negative reaction from China, and for the next 7 years, India did not conduct multilateral naval exercises in its waters that involved Japan, right? It was only 2014 that Prime Minister Singh finally invited Prime Minister Abe to actually officially rejoin the Malabar exercises. Economic coercion is another big danger, and this is particularly the case in trade, where Japan can't act as a substitute for Chinese trade because the composition of trade from Japan is very different from the composition of trade that India has with China. But on investment, there is a real potential for Japan to be that hedge, that insurance policy in the long term that India seeks. And even Prime Minister Modi knows this, in the sense that he has reaffirmed China's importance as a major partner, a major power, and a major trading partner to India. So he's also hedging his bets in that sense. It's not a sort of let's ally and balance against China approach. And even if that were to be the case, for Japan to be a proper hedge against India, India and Japan should be able to fulfill one of three conditions, right? They should either be able to jointly compel China to accept outcomes that they seek in East Asia or in Asia, broadly speaking, or they should be able to jointly deter China from infringing on their interests in Asia, or they should at least be able to form a defensive alliance, right? And at the moment, and based on future trajectories, the first two are definitely ruled out, based on the sheer gap that exists between China and these two countries. The defensive alliance seems possible in today's world of sort of churn and really imaginative and innovative foreign policy. But again, other conditions would have to fall into place on the Japanese side for Japan to really make a commitment. but also on the Indian side in terms of, as Ambassador Raghavan was talking about, a sort of whole of government approach, where the government needs to understand that in order to have the kind of alliance that might deter China, the kind of US-Japan alliance, you need all of government to sort of mesh together and work well together. And at this point, the India-Japan relationship is being driven largely from the top. And a few ministries are sort of getting the message, but not everyone. So, so India's sort of main goal then for Japan, with Japan rather, is far more economic. And India basically prioritizes Japan because Japan has assertively courted India. And in that sense, Japan is looking for a partner that can help it diversify its security relationships, and India is looking for an investor. And that's a perfect marriage of convenience, and that works for now. Japan wants to create interdependence in the long term, and it wants to do that by increasing the cost of adjustment for India as far as investment is concerned, and also to increase the cost of adjustment for Japan as far as diplomatic support is concerned. So to get up to a point, it would be actually costly for India to seek other sources of investment and Japan to seek other sources of strategic partnership. Whether they can do that or not really depends on one thing, which is again echoed in Ambassador Raghavan's talk about Russia, which is the ability to create a broad-based economic partnership. At the moment, trade between India and Japan is a very small portion of overall trade for India or Japan. Investment looks good. ODA is entering infrastructure, but it's basically loans. So there's not really the kind of societal level of cooperation that needs to exist for a true strategic partnership to be formed. I mean, if the US-India relationship is anything to go by, you need that level of private sector involvement on both sides to actually lobby the governments involved to change policy and to have a deeper engagement, which we don't have yet in the India-Japan case. But the situation is very dynamic. Both sides are working on it. The ease of doing business is a major issue for Japanese companies, and the Modi government is trying very hard, as its predecessors have tried, to make it easier for Japanese to actually give preferential treatment to Japanese companies. To that extent, they are going out of their way. And so in that sense, the real challenge is going to be to form that core bilateral economic relationship that is decoupled from the larger geopolitics of Asia. Because so long as India and Japan are hostage to the Sino-US competition, the Sino-Japanese historical problems, and the weakness of the US-Japan alliance, they're not going to be able to actually form that deep economic engagement. Because so far it's been driven by these strategic concerns to some extent, and by India's long-term economic needs. So I think I'll just leave it at that, and thank you very much.